Yo, what's going on guys, Jin here. This is going to be a basic ball lightning build for endgame of Season 4. It decimates overworld content and is really good for speed farming nightmare dungeons. As for the pits, even with only mid-level gear and wrongly affixed items, it can clear between 80 to 90 and farm 70 to 80 without issue. Ubers are used in this build, but alternatives will be listed and can work really well for the levels I mentioned. If you like these kinds of builds, like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell as it helps out the channel a lot. Leave a comment down below as well if you want. Now let's get to the build. So for the skill tree, we're going to take 2 into Firebolt. We're going to take 1 into Devastation here, 3 into Elemental Dominance, 1 into Charge Bolts, and go for the Destructive Charge Bolts. Then in our defensive skills, we take 1 into Flame Shield, we take 1 into Teleport to go for Shimmering Teleport, we take 3 into Glass Cannon, and 1 into Elemental Attunement. We also take 1 into Ice Armor, and go for Shimmering Ice Armor. Down in our Conjuration skills, we're taking the Ice Blades, and going for Summoned Ice Blades. Then we're also taking 1 into Lightning Spear, and go for Invoked Lightning Spear. Also 3 points in Conjuration Mastery, 1 in Align the Elements, and 3 points in Mana Shield, as well as 3 points in Protection. In our Mastery skills, we're taking 1 into Inner Flames, and 3 into Devouring Blaze. We're also taking 5 into Ball Lightning, of course, and going for Wizard's Ball Lightning. We'll also take 1 into Static Discharge, and 3 into Invigorating Conduit. In our ultimate skills, we're taking 1 into Coursing Currents, and 3 into Electrocution. We'll also take 1 into Unstable Currents, as well as taking Prime Unstable Currents. Lastly, our key passive, we're going to take Viz Mastery. That wraps up the skill tree. Let's move on to the Paragon board. In the starting board, we're going to take Elementalist. That's going to give us fire, cold, or lightning damage to an enemy. We'll increase all damage we deal to them by 5% for 10 seconds, stacking once per element. For the second board, we're going to take the Enchantment Master board, and we're going to put in the Reinforce Glyph, so that's going to give us 125% bonus to all rare nodes, giving us a lot of extra non-physical damage and resistance to all elements. We also gain 15% damage reduction while we have an active barrier. For our third board, we're going to go for the Burning Instinct board, and we're going to put in the Tactician Glyph here. So that's going to give us 10% increased damage for 4 seconds after casting a defensive skill. This duration is increased by 4 seconds for each defensive skill not on our action bar. And we also gain 125% bonus to all rare nodes within range, so in this case the damage to burning enemies and damage reduction from burning enemies. For our fourth board, we're going to get the Frigid Fate board, making sure we take the legendary node. And we're going to put in the Adept Glyph here for our Mastery skill damage. For our fifth board, we go to the right for our Ceaseless Conduit board, and we're going to put in the Destruction Glyph for critical strike damage, as well as critical strikes will increase all damage the enemy takes from us by 2% for 10 seconds, up to 12%. For our sixth board, we have the Searing Heat board, and we're going to put in the Exploit Glyph. That's going to allow us to have a lot of extra vulnerable damage, and dealing damage to a vulnerable enemy increases our damage by 1% for 6 seconds up to 10%. For our 7th board, we have the Static Surge board, and we're going to put in the Flame Feeder Glyph. That's going to give us damage to burning enemies, and we deal 10% increased damage to burning enemies. For our 8th board, we go back up to our Frigid Fate board, but to the left, and we're going to put in the Charge Glyph. That's going to give us crackling energy damage, as well as picking up crackling energy grants us 5% increased damage for 5 seconds, stacking up to 15%. And this board is the Elemental Summoner board. So that wraps up the Paragon board. Nice and simple. If I went too fast for you, don't forget to check out the description below, as that will have the full build planner, including the gear, variants of the gear that you'll be using, all of the Paragon board, and the skill tree. So next up we have the enchantments. For our first enchantment we have the Ice Blades enchantment, so for every 40 seconds in cooldowns we spend, we spawn an Ice Blades on a random enemy. Also we have the 2 modifiers from the upgraded nodes that we took. For our second enchantment we're going to put in the Firebolt enchantment. So direct damage from skills applies up to an additional 30% burning damage over 8 seconds. And this is how we proc our Flame Feeder glyph as well as Devouring Blaze. So just a quick side note for your skill bar, if you don't have enough cooldown reduction to keep your Unstable Currents active at all times basically, then you would swap Ice Blades for Lightning Spear, and that will help you stun and vulnerable all of the enemies in the pit on the way to the boss, and make your clear a little bit smoother. So next up we have the gear. So on the left I'm going to list the affixes for the gear, and the tempering that you would want to get on the gear. So we're going to start with the helm. I'm using a Harlequin crest, and I'm going to masterwork that in order to try and get cooldown reduction. Now this is an uber unique. If you don't have access to this, you would use a normal helm with mana per second, intelligence, and cooldown reduction, and you would masterwork the cooldown reduction on that as well. As for the tempering, you would use max life and lucky hit % chance to freeze. As for the aspect, you would want to use Mage Lords here, so Viz Mastery Key passive will grant you 6 to 9% damage reduction for each close enemy, up to 18 to 27%, so that's a lot of damage reduction there. Alternatively, you could use a Godslayer Crown, again looking to masterwork the cooldown reduction, and that'll also give you an awesome unique aspect, so when you stun, freeze or immobilize an elite enemy or damage a boss, you'll pull in nearby enemies dealing 30 to 60% increased damage to them for 3 seconds, and this can occur once every 12 seconds. Next up we have the chest piece. We're going to be looking for a Raiment of the Infinite, and we're going to be trying to masterwork the damage to close enemies. You get access to a unique aspect, so after using teleport, close enemies are pulled to you and stunned for 2 to 3 seconds, but teleport's cooldown is increased by 20%. If you don't have access to a Raiment, use something with intelligence, max life, and mana per second, and you would temper that with max life, and lucky hit % chance to slow. As for the masterworking, you would try and masterwork the intelligence. For the aspect, you would use the aspect of concentration, so conjuration skills will give you 10 to 20% damage reduction for 5 seconds when cast. Next up we have the gloves. We're just using normal gloves with crit chance, attack speed, and intelligence. And we're also going to try and temper that with damage to close enemies and lucky hit % chance to immobilize if possible. We're going to try and masterwork the attack speed, and for the aspect we're going to use gravitational, so ball lightning will orbit around us, dealing 10 to 25% increased damage. Next up we have the pants. We're just going to be using some normal pants here with intelligence, armor, and max life. We're going to try and temper it with total armor %, and for the lucky hit we're going to look for % chance to stun. As for the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the intelligence, and for the aspect we're using Everliving, so we'll take 10 to 25% less damage from crowd controlled or vulnerable enemies. For the boots, we're going to be using some normal boots here, and we're going to try and get the ball lightning ranks, mana per second, and intelligence. We're going to try and temper that with teleport cooldown reduction and immobilize duration. As for the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the ranks into ball lightning, and for the aspect we're using concussive strikes, so damaging an enemy has up to a 20% chance to daze them for 2 seconds on lucky hit, and you deal 5 to 20% increased damage to dazed enemies. Next up we have the main hand. We're going to be looking for something with intelligence, vulnerable, and crit damage or max life. and we're going to try and temper that with damage to close enemies, and chance for ball lightning projectiles to cast twice. As for the masterworking, you're going to try and masterwork the intelligence, and for the aspect, you're going to be looking for accelerating. So critical strikes with core skills increase your attack speed by 10 to 25% for 5 seconds. I'm using a dagger here for the damage to close enemies. For the offhand, we're going to be looking for something with crit chance, intelligence, and cooldown reduction. And for the tempering, we're going to look for the same as the main hand, damage to close enemies, and chance for ball lightning projectiles to cast twice. For the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the cooldown reduction. As for the aspect, we're using Conceited, so we'll deal 10 to 25% increased damage whilst having a barrier active. Next up we have the amulet. So for the amulet, we're going to be looking for something with ranks to Conjuration Mastery, cooldown reduction, and attack speed. We're going to try and temper that with Unstable Currents, cooldown reduction, and damage to close enemies. And we're going to try and masterwork the Conjuration Mastery. As for the aspect, we're going to imprint Storm Swell here, so we deal 23 to 45% increased damage to vulnerable enemies while we have a barrier. Next up, we have the rings. Now we're going to be using the Talrash's Iridescent Loop here, that's going to give us non-physical damage, resource generation, cooldown reduction, and some lucky hit chance. But importantly, for each type of elemental damage we deal, we gain 10 to 15% increased damage for 4 seconds, up to 40 to 60%. And dealing any elemental damage refreshes all of these bonuses. For the masterworking, you're going to try and masterwork the cooldown reduction. For the secondary ring, we're going to be using a Ring of Starless Skies if we have it. This is an uber unique ring. And we're going to try and masterwork the critical strike chance on it. So the unique aspect for this ring is spending your primary resource reduces the resource cost of our skills, and increases damage by 10% for 3 seconds, and that will stack up to 4 times for 40%. So that means we will spend 40% less resources to cast our skills and deal 40% more damage. If you don't have access to either of these rings, you would want to use a ring with crit chance, attack speed, and resource cost reduction. And you would want to temper that with Unstable Currents cooldown reduction, and damage to close enemies. And for the masterworking, you would want to masterwork the cooldown reduction. As for the aspect, you would want to use Prodigies first, so using a cooldown restores 10 to 25 mana, and if you don't have either of the rings for the second aspect, you would want to use something like Shredding Blades, so your Ice Blade's chance to apply vulnerable is increased by 20%, and the vulnerable duration is increased by 4 seconds. You also gain 15 to 30% vulnerable damage. Or you could use something like Control, so you deal 20 to 35% more damage to immobilized, stunned, or frozen enemies. Both are really good options, but that's only if you don't have Talrash's or Ring of Starless Skies. So that pretty much wraps it up for the gear. As for the gems, we're going to be using a skull and 2 diamonds in the jewellery, although if you have enough resistances, you could easily use 2 skulls and 1 diamond. For the weapon and offhand, we're going to be using the blue gems, the sapphires, for the vulnerable damage. And in the armor, we're going to be using the rubies for maximum life %. So that's the end of the build. It's a pretty standard one and still fun to play, but I would say overall not as epic as Frozen Orb. So thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell too. It helps out the channel a lot. Leave a comment with your favourite builds this season in the comment section below, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye!